2011, but if you remember your history, that's when the president of Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, lost his job in the Egyptian Revolution, in the so-called Arab Spring. And so that class got canceled. Then I was supposed to go with the same group to Lebanon. They have classes in Egypt and Lebanon and in Africa, and they've taught other places. And so in 2019, I was all set to go with them to Lebanon to teach in Lebanon, and the day before I was to fly out of Minneapolis, Lebanon was having a crisis and they canceled the class. And so I didn't go with them in 2019. Then, of course, COVID hit, and I haven't been overseas to teach until last week since the beginning of COVID. I was going to go to Africa, and then they were shut down of course, all of 2020, the world was closed. Then I was going to go to Africa. Then I was going to go to Romania. Then last fall, I was supposed to go to Liberia. And you remember I was walking around church with this boot on my foot, and the doctor said, "You better not go." So that trip got canceled. So in December, a man named Paul Holritz called me, sent me an email and said, "Is there any way you can go to Uganda in January?" And I talked to Rebecca, and we decided that that was something that I should try to do. And so I went to the country of Uganda, called the Pearl of Africa. You can see it there located. It's a landlocked country in East Africa. I've been to Kenya, which is on its border, and I was invited to come to Uganda to teach. And I spent 8 days in the country of Uganda. Just a little bit of history here on Uganda. Uganda became a British protectorate in 1894. Christianity actually came to Uganda in 1859. There was a very well-known story of some martyrs. In 1886, 22 Roman Catholic men and 23 Anglican men were actually burned to death. They were in the court of Mutesa I, the Kabaka of at that time it was called Buganda, and the issue was homosexuality. As a part of their duties in the Ugandan court, they had to perform homosexual acts, and as Christians of some one sort or another, they refused, and they were burned alive. And there's a shrine dedicated to the Ugandan martyrs. I wasn't able to get over to that because I was kept so busy. I taught 28 and a half hours in 7 days, and there just wasn't any time to go and see it. But so Christianity has been around. There have been a number of martyrs in the Christian faith, missionaries that went over there and they were killed. And so Uganda has this interesting history with Christianity. Now, you may remember, we're all old enough to remember the dictator Idi Amin. Uganda became an independent country in 1962, and in 1971, 9 years later, the third president of Uganda was a military guy, Idi Amin, who became a dictator. And there's actually a number of movies that have been made about that. The Last King of Scotland, because that's what he called himself, among other things, the Last King of Scotland. And there was a very well-known hijacking that Arabs hijacked a plane full of Israelis and landed at Entebbe. That's the airport I flew in and out of, at Entebbe Airport, and held these Israelis hostage, and the Israeli government sent several plane loads of Israeli soldiers, and they went in and rescued nearly all the hostages. Uganda is located on Lake Victoria. This lake is bordered by Tanzania and Kenya and Uganda. This is the second largest freshwater lake in the world behind Lake Superior. This is one of they call them the 5 Great Lakes of Africa. And it's a huge body of water. And so they're located, and Entebbe is located in a point down there. You fly out over the lake when you fly out from the airport at Entebbe. The capital is Kampala. We were about not quite halfway between Entebbe, the airport, and the capital city of Kampala, a city of about 10 million people. On Friday, I left on Wednesday here in Minneapolis, a week ago Wednesday, and it was a 26-hour flight. I flew to Atlanta, then to Amsterdam, then I got on a plane in Amsterdam and flew to Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, and then back to Entebbe, and got in on Thursday afternoon, Thursday evening. And on Friday, the director of the program arranged for several of us to go to the headwaters of the Nile River. The Nile River is the longest river in the world, and it actually begins in Lake Victoria. There are 2 tributaries that form the Nile River. One is the White Nile, and you can see it from the air. It has to do with the mud on the banks that turn the river kind of a cloudy white at its origin. And the river is over 4,100 miles long, and it's part of how Africa was explored. You know the famous Dr. Livingstone, I presume. You had a British and American journalist by the name of Henry Stanley that went looking for Livingstone as Livingstone was exploring Africa. And they were all looking for the headwaters of the Nile. It's in a place called Jinja. We flew a Mission Aviation Fellowship plane down across the way, and a beautiful country, seeing Uganda from the air. And we went to Lake Victoria, got on a boat, and motored around just a small part of Lake Victoria. If you were to try to traverse the lake, it's only second in size to Lake Superior. It's a huge lake. And, here we are, there are fishing villages on the side. What was really interesting was that our guide in the boat that day was wearing a U of M t-shirt. And here's my son, a student at the U of M, and this guy's got a U of M t-shirt. I'm not exactly sure how he got it. I don't think he was a student at the University of Minnesota, but he's got one of these health sciences t-shirts from the University of Minnesota. And he explained to us some of Lake Victoria. This is at the point where the Nile River begins, looking back into Lake Victoria, and here's the place where the Nile River empties out, and there's a small little rock island. There used to be a fountain there. When I say water's bubbling up, and it's pretty much because they've raised the water level with dams along the river, all that's left is this platform out in the river lake and the sign that says the beginning of the Nile River. But I can say now I've been to the beginning of the Nile River, the longest river in the world, in the middle of Lake Victoria. There's that picture on the left is looking down the headwaters of the Nile River, the longest river in the world. It was really something. I don't know if you can see the monkeys in the picture on the right, and the picture on the left, there is on the stump, there is a large lizard. I'm talking about a big African lizard there, sunning himself on the rock, and then there's a bird with a big beak. The problem is the jungle is so, the vegetation is so dense, it's hard to see these things, but I wanted to try to put up some pictures. There's no big African animals in this part of Uganda because there's too much population, but there's a lot of smaller animals, beautiful birds, and whatnot. My destination in going there was Word of Life Campus. Word of Life Uganda is a facility, and in fact, Uganda is a very hilly place. And as you know, for 10 months I hobbled around on a bandaged foot, and I am amazed at how weak I became in those 10 months. And it was actually kind of nice going to Uganda because everywhere I went, I had to climb stairs. I climbed stairs from my living quarters up to the main, sort of the parking lot, and from there up to the dining hall. And every time I turned around, I was walking up and up and up and up. And every morning I got my heart going by walking up to breakfast. And so this is the Word of Life campus in Uganda. And then to teach my class, I had to walk up another 20 steps to the classroom building, up yet higher. And so it was a great time of exercise, just walking up and down to class for these days. We were fed well fed by Peter, our Kenyan cook, who worked about 12 or 14 hours a day cooking for the group. There were 40 students that were there to go to school, plus there's a Christian day school, plus Word of Life's got all kinds of things. And Peter, the gentleman on the left, was our cook. And every morning he made me an omelet. I ate about $30 worth of eggs while I was in Uganda last week. Now, I don't know what they pay for eggs in Uganda, but if I'd eaten that many eggs in the U.S., it'd probably cost me $20 to $30. I can't believe the price of eggs. The chickens are getting loaded by delivering eggs here in the United States. But Peter did a great job cooking on charcoal all week long and cooking for 100 or more people in these large pots. But it was just a delightful time. I certainly didn't lose any weight. There were a lot of critters there. I don't know if you can see, I'm sleeping in a bed with a mosquito net. One of the problems that you run into in Africa is malaria, and you have to sleep under mosquito netting lest you get bit by these small mosquitoes that are carriers of malaria. And then the bowl of sugar on the right is filled with ants. I mean, it's just part of life in Africa. We'd be sitting around at night and see chameleons or lizards on the posts around the place. And they're actually your friends because they're eating some of the insects, you know. And so it was a fascinating place to be, to see the local critters and culture and things like that. Of course, the reason I went was to teach, and this is the graduate group of students. I had 6 of these students in my class for the 7 days. We started teaching on Saturday. We met on Saturday, had a couple of classes. I taught a total of 28 and a half hours while I was there. And 6 of these men, interesting thing, one of my students was actually from Abbotsford, British Columbia. He's from Kenya. He goes back over to East Africa and trains pastors. And he got into this program, so when he goes back, he takes these classes in Africa. And so I had a man from Rwanda, Patty from Rwanda. His father had 9 wives. Patty's mother left his father when he was a small child. And it's interesting, the students, when they introduce themselves, they'll tell you, my name is Wellington and I have 1 wife. Because this is a polygamous world over there. And the Christians have recognized that Christianity is about 1 man and 1 woman. In fact, some African cultures are more conservative than some of the cultures in the West. 32 countries in Africa still outlaw homosexuality. I was in the country of Kenya a number of years ago when Barack Obama was president, and he actually visited Nairobi. He came to town a day or so before I left. I saw Air Force One sitting out at the Nairobi airport. And there was a big kerfuffle because the gay community in the U.S. wanted Obama to put pressure on the Kenyan government to relax its laws against homosexuality. And there were newspapers that basically said, tell Obama to mind his own business. And Africa still, there are, like I said, 32 countries in Africa still make homosexuality against the law. We just became the first state in the Union to entrench abortion. Just in the last week, I think. The Archbishop of the Church of Uganda, it's an Anglican church. The Archbishop of the Church of Uganda, in his Christmas letter, the Church of England is one of the largest churches in Africa. It has local networks, so the Church of Uganda is the Uganda version of the Anglican Church. And the Archbishop, in his Christmas message, rebuked the Church of England in England for its welcoming language to homosexuals. And he said, words to the effect, you might be the Church of England, but you are not Anglican, because Anglicans believe the Bible, and we're not going to follow you in your stand on homosexuality. Gay marriage. What was I said? Yeah, gay marriages. It was really something. Africa is still very conservative. So these students, I had a student from Rwanda, I had some students from Kenya, and then, of course, some students from Uganda. And a couple of pastors were in the class also nearly the whole week. They weren't taking the class for credit, but they were in the class nearly the whole week. And so it was a real blessed time. We had several prayer meetings. This is Paul Holrich, the man that is the dean of the school and runs the program, and the class there on the right-hand side. My class was the history of Christianity in Africa. And of course, I've been a church historian all my vocational teaching career. The first class I taught was a history of the Baptists in Canada in the late 1990s. I've taught Baptist history, I've taught Christian history. A few years ago, I was going back and forth to Zambia. They wanted me to teach 4 classes, and I thought, if I'm going to teach in Africa, I need to put together a class on the history of Christianity in Africa. And I've taught that 4 or 5 times now in Zambia and Kenya and now in Uganda. And so it's just a real blessing for me to study that and to put it together and to teach that and to show the students in Africa that Christianity is not a white man's religion. In early African Christianity, North Africa played a central role in the development of early Christianity. John Mark was from Alexandria in Egypt. And some of the early church fathers, Tertullian was from Carthage, and Augustine was from North Africa. Now, in the 7th century, Islam came up out of the Arabian Peninsula and swept across North Africa and conquered North Africa and drove Christianity into the sea. People either went back to Europe, across the Mediterranean, or they became Muslims. The Muslims would tax Christians more heavily. And so it was to their financial advantage to convert to Islam for tax purposes. At one time, before Islam conquered North Africa, there were 1,100 churches, bishops. That number was reduced to 5. And much of North Africa today has almost no Christian witness to it. But when you help these African men understand that Christianity has a strong African component, they really, because so much of later Christianity is heavily influenced by European colonialism. Well, I won't teach the history of Christianity in Africa now, but it was a real blessing to teach these men and to be with them in class. And I thank the Lord for these brethren. They were eager to learn. We had some great discussions on theology and church history and various things. We talked about polygamy. And Wellington, the guy in the blue there, his father came from a family that his father was the only one of his brothers who could say that he only had one wife. Polygamy was very much a part of African tradition before Christianity came in. After class was over, they had a time of student testimonies, and it was just a blessing. And then when things ended on Friday, we went out for dinner, the teachers, the professors, and we parted company, and I got on an airplane at 10 minutes to midnight and flew back to the United States, and I was home last Saturday afternoon. And I really appreciate you praying for my family. We didn't have a PCA. My wife was able to take care of Joshua. We're still struggling with the PCA situation, not able to find adequate PCAs. We met with a new PCA company today to see if we're going to be able to get a PCA. I don't know if we're going to be able to fill the role of PCAs. I'm supposed to go to Liberia and do some help with some organization of a Bible college there. But it was a real blessing. Berean had a hand in supporting me on this trip, and I thank you for that, and I appreciate your prayers. And Brother Carey just asked me to do this. Any questions or comments about my trip? It was really a delightful trip, just such a blessing. It was interesting. One day, students asked me, "Can you tell us about your family?" And I told them about Joshua, my son in a wheelchair, and about my wife, and about difficulty finding PCAs. In Wellington, he said, "Can we pray for your family?" And Patty, the Rwandan man, prayed an absolutely beautiful intercessory prayer for my family. It was moving. It brought me to tears. It was just such a blessing to hear this man pray for me and to get to know these men. And I've got students all around the world. I've got students from India and students from Romania and students from Africa and various places in Africa. And it's just such a blessing to be able to train men to the things that I learned to pass on to them, that they can pass on to the next generation of Christian believers and Christian leaders in Africa. Well, any questions? Why don't we go to prayer then?